So it is 6:31. It is a minute past the appointed hour, as my board chair would say. I'd like to welcome everybody to a very special holiday history happy hour. It is one of the most popular one of these history happy hours that we have ever done. So I'm really excited about this. I'm really happy that you have chosen to join us on this. If you're in Gettysburg, warm Friday evening. Hope the weather is good where you are. My name is Pete Mealy. I am privileged to serve here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center as the executive director and as the president of the Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation. I am joined this evening on the back of house of Zoom by our Director of Education and Museum Operations, Cody H. Cody, wave, hi.
Everybody.
And then Rob Williams is over at the Shriver House running technical things from over there. And we'll get to an introduction of our host in just a moment. But as I said just before, this is the most popular, one of the most popular history happy hours that we have been privileged to do here. History Happy Hour is an opportunity for our friends, our members, our supporters to come together once a month virtually to have a discussion with a speaker about a topic related to the Civil War. And we started doing these, of course, during the shutdown that accompanied the first wave of COVID about a year and a half ago. But we found that people enjoyed them so much that, hey, why not continue to do it? So this is a great way to bring our friends together and to have a little fun on a Friday evening. Next month, we're going to be gathering on the third Friday in June. That is third Friday in June. Boy, I'm jumping ahead here. The third Friday in January comes after December. At 6:30, we're going to be welcoming historian Chris Gertz. He is going to be talking about his new book called Charles Lindbergh, A Religious Biography of the World, America's Most Infamous Pilot. And you might be wondering, what does that have to do with what we do here? But we here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center spend a lot of time looking at historical events through a religious lens. And we thought that this might be a little bit interesting to look at this famous man in the early 20th century through a religious lens. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to reading the book during my time off between Christmas and New Year's. And I think we're going to have a really great conversation. So that is going to be Friday, January 21st at 6:30 p.m. And keep an eye on your email for the registration for that. So tonight you have joined us. We thank you for Christmas in Gettysburg. And our really great friend, Nancie Gudmestad, and I wrote that out phonetically, from the Shriver House Museum is joining us from across town. Nancie is a great friend of the museum. The Shriver House is a great place to visit when you come to Gettysburg. So we really hope that if you haven't visited yet, that this might inspire you to travel there the next time that you are in Gettysburg. And two things that I will say about Nancie. She's getting nervous. First, the Shriver House just celebrated their 25th anniversary. It was the weekend after Thanksgiving. They had a really great open house reception. I was privileged to attend. So 25 years in Gettysburg. And she has also just told us that she is wearing her red Christmas Converse sneakers. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Nancie. I know this is going to be a great event, and enjoy yourselves. If you have questions, throw them in the chat as we're going through, and we'll get to those at the end. And Nancie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Pete. I'm so happy to be here, but I really didn't understand this was a cocktail party or that kind of a thing, or I would have had a glass of wine with me here, but maybe next time I'll do that. But I'm here, I've been invited to talk about Christmas in the 1860s. But I would like to talk about Christmas for the Shriver family here from the Shriver House. And this is a little bit different than what we do the rest of the year, but the house looks just absolutely beautiful during Christmas. I am going to be going back and forth on my iPad to see what you're looking at so I can tell what I'm supposed to be talking about. But first off, the Shriver family. George Shriver was a young man born down on Marsh Creek Road, just off of Gettysburg Road. When he was only 15 years old, his father passed away and left that great big family farm to George. And the farm included several thousand gallons of liquor. It turns out the Shrivers had been making whiskey on that farm since the 1780s. Well, this left George a pretty wealthy young man and with some knowledge about the liquor business. George married a neighbor girl, Hetty Wycott, there on the right, when they were both 18 years old. They started a family right away. They had two little girls, Sadie and Molly, but soon decided they really didn't want to live out there on the farm. They wanted to come in town to build a beautiful new house and open up a new business, Shriver's Saloon and 10 Pin Alley. So they built the house in 1860, and we believe they moved in just before the holidays in 1860. This, unfortunately, is the Shriver House 136 years later. It sat abandoned for almost 30 years. And when my husband and I bought the house, we originally bought with the idea was to tell the stories of families from all around town and what they went through during the battle. But in the middle of the restoration, we started piecing together the story of the family who built the house, the Shriver family. And it turns out that their story is just so incredible that we decided if you're going to stand on their floorboards, you really ought to hear their story. When they opened up the house, or when they built it, they also built it with a business, Shriver's Saloon and 10 Pin Alley. And there's the sign for the saloon. They moved in just before Christmas in 1860. So what's the first thing you want to do when you have a brand new house? You want to show it off to all your friends and neighbors. So we have the house set up like they're having an open house party to show off their new home. I'm sure the house would have been filled with lots of guests, women wearing their most fancy dresses, giving them an excuse to wear their biggest hoops, gentlemen standing around smoking a cigar in their finely dressed clothing. And I can imagine the house filled with little kids running around to check out all the festivities going on that day. The Christmas tree, when you were having a party back then, of course, you wanted to have a Christmas tree. Now, Christmas trees, that was a very new thing here in America. But both George and Hetty were German. Christmas trees started in Germany. So this is a tradition that would have come over with their families. And I can imagine Sadie and Molly Shriver, they were about 3 and 5 years old when they moved into the house. I always picture them sitting on the front porch steps waiting for George to bring the wagon around. He finally does. They hop on the wagon. They take a ride about 3 miles outside of town to Hetty Wycott's parents' farm, the Jacob Wycott farm. It's still there today on Tonytown Road. It's just a gorgeous house. So Sadie and Molly would rummage through the woods and they'd look for the very perfect Christmas tree. They'd find the right one. George would cut it down. They'd bring it back home, and then George would go to work. He would cut the branches out to form layers in the Christmas tree. If you look at old Victorian pictures, you will often see where the trees are layered. They did that because when we exchange presents today, we wrap them up in pretty paper and bows, and we put our gifts underneath the tree. Back then, they didn't use wrapping paper, or they might use a little bit of ribbon, but they would take their gifts and stuff them deep inside the tree. If you listen to the words to that old song, I'll Be Home for Christmas, it says we want snow and mistletoe and presents on the tree, not under the tree. It's funny, I've listened to more modern versions and they do say under the tree, but initially it was on the tree because that's the way they did it back then. The tree would have been stuffed with all sorts of things, toys, dolls, horns, sailboats, toy elephants, and just crammed with stuff for a very special Christmas. This was the Shrivers' first Christmas in 1860 in this house. They were young, they were wealthy, so this tree would have been pretty full of some great presents. You'll notice that there are flags on the tree. I mentioned that George and Hetty both came from German descendants. They were very, very proud to be Americans, so dressing your tree with flags was a nice way to show your patriotism. We also believe that's the way George Washington Shriver got his name. Back then, it was very popular for immigrants to name their children after prominent Americans, hence George Washington Shriver. So the flags was also a way to demonstrate their patriotism as well. Let's see, candles. They did use real candles in the Christmas tree. Generally, they were lit one time, but there was always a great big bucket of water close by, just in case. The first year we would put up the tree, we just were not sure what to put on top of the tree, but I did some research. I was lucky enough to find an account by a little girl here in Gettysburg in the 1860s. She said at Christmas time, her mother took one of her small dolls, wrapped her up in white gauze, put silver wings on her back and a gold star in her arms, and that was the inspiration for the top of the tree. Underneath the tree, you'll see a Noah's Ark. Now, if you come for a tour of the Shriver's home any other time of the year, you'll see that Noah's Ark up on a shelf in Sadie and Molly's bedroom. Because it was sort of a religious game, a lot of families, the children were only allowed to play with that game on Sundays and religious holidays like Easter and Christmas, which is why it's downstairs here under the tree. But other than that, it had to stay up on the shelf, and eventually they just called it the Sunday game because that's where it belonged unless it was a special holiday. There are cookies and carrots under the tree. Of course, that would be Sadie and Molly going for a little extra insurance for a nice Christmas morning the next day. They did use stockings. There are stockings hanging here on the mantle. If a child was good throughout the year, they would expect to find an orange tucked into the toe of their stocking on Christmas morning. For some children, that was the only orange they would see in an entire year. And for some other children, that was Christmas. I've been doing these Christmas tours for quite a while, and I've met a number of people. I remember one woman in particular, born and raised in West Virginia. She said they were very poor. She said for weeks before Christmas, she would go to bed just praying that she would find an orange tucked into the toe of her Christmas stocking. We have a little shop cat. Her name is Buddy, and she came to introduce herself. You might hear her, but I'm not sure if you'll see her, but she does like to make an appearance. So she said she would pray to find that orange in her stocking on Christmas morning. She said the years that she got an orange, you would have thought they won $1 million. She was just so excited. But then she said they didn't get an orange every year. The boy, Christmas has changed quite a bit in all these years. Now, if a child was not so good throughout the year, they might find something else tucked into the toe of their Christmas stocking. And you'll see on the table there a little pile of coal. Hold on. Oh, okay. Okay. So they might find some coal tucked into the stocking of their tree. Now, or stocking. Now, I didn't even recognize that stuff. I didn't know what it was because, you know, of course, I never got coal in the bottom of my stocking. Would never happen. Let's see. In the center hall of the house, decorating with greens was a really, really big thing to do. If anybody has ever been down to Cape May, New Jersey around Christmas time, that town is just filled with those big, beautiful Victorian houses. At Christmas time, boy, they are just decked to the rafters with Christmas decorations everywhere. That heavy decorating, it really didn't come about until about the 1880s or 90s. In the 1860s, it was very simply done. They tucked greens behind any kind of evergreen they could find. Holly, rosemary, pine, cedar, boxwood, all of those things. They would make wreaths out of it, lots and lots of garland. They would tuck greens behind everything that hung on the walls, mirrors, pictures, the clocks, anything at all, because that was a nice way to make the house look very, very festive. And you know, after doing this for quite a while, I really believe that less is more. There are not lots of Christmas decorations around the Christmas home, but boy, you really do get a festive feel when you go inside the house because it just looks so beautiful. In the middle there, underneath the lamp, there is a mistletoe, very popular at the time. Now, there was an old story. A man would stand in the hallway talking to the other guys at the party, and I'm pretending that they were really deep in discussion for politics and things like that. But what they were really waiting for was a young lady to walk through the center hallway so they could grab her by the waist and plant a nice Christmas kiss on her cheek. Well, every time there was a kiss, you had to pull one of those little white berries off of the mistletoe. And once those berries were gone, so was the power of the mistletoe. No more kisses. So when you go out to buy a mistletoe, make sure you get one with lots and lots of berries for a very nice Christmas party. Now let's see, we're going to head up to the second floor of the Shriver's home, talk about some things up there. One of my favorite rooms up there is George and Hetty's bedroom. They did use Christmas stockings, of course, as we saw downstairs. They were not the fancy kind that we buy or make today. On Christmas Eve, Sadie and Molly would run up into Hetty's bedroom. They'd rummage through the drawers. They would look for the longest pair of stockings they could find, the ones that would hold the most amount of stuff, and those are the stockings that they would hang up downstairs on the mantle. During the restoration of the house, we found out that there was a very old custom. In those days, when a family would build a new home, they would take a shoe from a family member. They would stuff it inside the walls of the house during construction, and that would bring the family good luck. During the restoration, we found a tiny child's shoe stuffed in the ceiling of George and Hetty's bedroom. We are sure it belonged to Sadie or Molly. We do have it on display, and I always like to tell people that I'll leave it up to you to figure out if it did bring them very much good luck. Sadie and Molly's bedroom, actually, this is my very favorite bedroom in the house. You can see that they're wrapping Christmas presents for the family. There's a letter on the table to Santa Claus, and I do have to back up because I forgot one very important thing. Down on the first floor, when we talked about the home, we talked about Christmas in 1860, and of course, that was a wonderful Christmas for George and Hetty Shriver. They were young, they had money, a brand new house, two beautiful little girls, a unique new business, and everything was perfect. And the most important thing is they had a very bright future in front of them. Little did they know. The Christmas in 1861 wasn't quite nearly as happy as the first Christmas they spent in the house. They were only in the house for about 4 months when the Civil War began. George's friends started signing up for the Union Army, but everybody said the war wouldn't last very long, so he didn't go off to fight right away. He stayed home. He put all the finishing touches on his businesses. Finally, he was ready to open, but the war was still raging on. So George decided it was really right for him to serve his country. He mustered into Cole's cavalry, and George was off to fight in the Civil War. They thought he'd be back home for Christmas. The war would be all over and life would move on, but that is not the way things worked out. So George did not make it home for Christmas in 1861. So it was a very, very different Christmas than the first Christmas they celebrated in the house. On the table in Sadie and Molly's bedroom, there's a little letter to Santa Claus. There is only one thing on that letter, and that is, of course, to have their father back home for the holidays. What could be better than that? When Hetty put the girls to bed that night, of course, she was doing her best to make it a happy Christmas, as happy as she could. But the very last thing Hetty would do before she tucked the girls in, she'd pull up a chair, sit next to the bed, and she'd read the girls a poem. 'Twas the night before Christmas. That was written in the 1820s, so that means Sadie and Molly, they knew all about Santa Claus and the reindeer. But of course, they didn't know anything about Rudolph because he was not born until 1936. He'd come along later. But again, that's why the cookies and carrots are downstairs on the table. Now let's see. Christmas in 1862. Yep, another year that George did not make it home for the holiday. And what do we do when times are tough? Most families, we would pull together. We always say, unless there's a pandemic, and that kind of throws our wrench into things. But that Christmas, George wasn't home. So I can imagine Hetty inviting some of her brothers and sisters to come and spend the holidays with them. Traveling back then was not nearly as easy today. So when you took a horse and wagon and rode 8 or 12 miles, you didn't just turn around and go back home at the end of the day. You would stay overnight. So I picture Hetty's house just filled with her cousins and nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters. Well, it was tight putting everybody up in that time. You know, there weren't that many beds, and it was a big house, but not that big of a house. And if you ran out of room and there wasn't enough room for the kids, what would they do back then? They just stick them upstairs in the attic. Not the way we would do it, but it is the way they would do it back then. I've given many a tour at Christmas time, and it's 13 or 12, 30 degrees outside, and it is absolutely freezing up there in that attic. But the beds would be covered with lots of quilts and woolens, and do the best to keep them warm. When those children went to bed at night, again, the last person, somebody would come up and read them. 'Twas the night before Christmas. They read the poem, the kids would look all snuggled in their bed, and then that parent would go back downstairs. Well, like any bunch of kids, they barely closed the door, and the kids were out of their beds, telling scary stories to their cousins, playing with games up there. Eventually, though, they'd start wondering about Santa Claus. So they'd grab a seat by the window, look out over that night sky, and just wait and wait and wait for Santa Claus to ride through the night sky. I'm sure they finally gave up because they didn't see anything. So eventually they'd just get back into bed, tuck themselves in. Of course, they'd lay awake as long as they could, waiting to hear those reindeer land on the rooftop upstairs. I never really know whether they waited long enough, but I'm sure maybe one of those kids did. Going back downstairs to the first floor of the Shriver's home, I'd like to go to Hetty's kitchen or their dining room. This is all set up for a very festive Christmas. Now, Christmas in 1863 is what we're talking about here. And of course, Christmas, that year of 1863 here in Gettysburg was like nothing that anyone ever dreamed of. It was just their worst nightmare. It was in July when 170,000 men came to this town. When they finally left, the town was completely devastated. The first few weeks after they left, it was just pure hell for the people who lived in this town. But that went on for quite a long while. It takes a long time to get over something like that. Well, they were kind of getting things back into order when in November of 1863, President Lincoln came to town. So another 20,000 people came to this town. Well, this was a little town of 2,400 people. They did not have the accommodations for that many people. So many people in town, they just opened up their front doors. They let anybody wander in, find a place to stay for the night. I did read where many people, they just ended up walking the streets all night long because they couldn't find a place to stay. But that Christmas was a nice one, though, for the family. At least they thought it was going to be. But unfortunately, George once again did not make it home for the holidays. But if you look at the Christmas table, there are 4 place settings on that table. Again, there's only one thing Sadie and Molly want for Christmas, and that is to have their father George back home for the holidays. So in anticipation, they do have a place setting for him. On each of the plates there at the dining table, there is a Christmas cracker, an old tradition that started in England in the 1830s, I think it was. You sit down to dinner, give that little thing a yank on both ends, it makes a loud pop, and out of it would fall a couple of prizes. There was always a poem, a little toy, some sort of sweet candy, and there was always a paper hat, and it's shaped like a crown, and it was customary to wear that paper crown for dinner during your holiday. Clear toy candy was another popular thing for the Germans back at this time, and they're just beautiful. They made all different shapes, all different colors, and these are things that Hetty could have made here at home, again with a recipe that would have been passed down through her family. But there was also a lovely confectionery store up on Chambersburg Street. So Sadie and Molly might wander up there instead to pick out something nice. On each of the girls' place setting is my favorite. Those are Springerly cookies. And I do apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but another old German custom. There was a beautiful sort of cake-like cookie. You used a special roller, and when you rolled it out, there were carvings in that roller, and it would emboss the cookie with just a beautiful scene. There were animals, there were people, there were Christmas trees, and all different kinds of things. And again, that was just very special, and they only made those at Christmas time. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, in Hetty's kitchen, I want to tell you about some of the what I thought very interesting German customs from that time period. The Germans believed at that time, if the ground was white at Christmas, it was going to be green at Easter. But if the ground was green at Christmas, it was going to be white at Easter. I always try to remember to check that out every year, and I always tend to forget. Now, the Germans also believed anything at all that you baked on Christmas Eve, no matter how long it stayed around the house, it would never, ever, ever go moldy. That's the way I want to bake, that's for sure. Pomanders were another very popular thing at the time, and of course we still make those today. They would take citrus, lemons, and oranges. You put enough cloves in there, and they would last for quite a while. They would use those as an air freshener. Also, they would tuck them in their dresser drawers because they didn't get to wash their clothes too often back in those days. I have a friend who has one of those pomanders that's probably 30 years old. There are so many cloves stuffed into that orange, you can't even tell that it is an orange. And once a year, she pulls it out and she rolls it in fresh cinnamon. And I think, pretty sure it's arrowroot that she would tuck in there as well that would help to preserve it. But after all those years, it's still absolutely gorgeous. When Christmas trees came to America, of course, the Americans had to put their own touch on it, their own spin on it. So we decided to put popcorn and cranberries on those trees. They didn't do that in Germany. That was definitely an American thing. And in our house here, the table is set up. It looks like Sadie is doing a great job. Molly is a little bit younger, and in the house, she's got more on the floor than she does on her string. So but she'll get the hang of it sooner or later. My favorite German tradition at that time period, the Germans believed that if you went out to the barn between 11 o'clock and midnight on Christmas Eve, you would actually be able to hear the animals having a conversation. Well, this was of concern to some of these families. So on Christmas Eve, they would make the best treats for their animals. That included cats and dogs, chickens, pigs, cows, horses, everybody, because they wanted to make sure that a little later in the evening, when those animals got together to have a little gossip session, they wouldn't say anything bad about their owners. So I highly recommend feeding your animals very, very well on Christmas Eve night. Now, this was Christmas in 1863, and of course, it was not a good one. Downstairs here in the saloon, we do have that all decorated up for Christmas. And yep, George did not make it home for Christmas in 1863. However, he did make it home on December 26th, 1863. Finally, Sadie and Molly, their Christmas wish came true. I often wonder about George coming home. He was in the cavalry. That means for the last 2 years, he was sitting on a horse, sleeping on the ground. God only knows how he was eating. You know, Sadie was 7 when he left, and she was 5, I'm sorry, when he left. And I'm sure she remembered him. But little Sadie, she had just turned 4 years old. George was gone for 2 years. I'm sure he did not look like the same man that left. And I always wondered, did she even recognize her father when he came home? That must have been a tough one. I'm pretty sure all of George's friends and family and relatives wanted to come and spend some time with George when he was home, but I'm betting that George wanted to spend all of his time with Hetty and his 2 little girls. Well, sadly, on December 29th, once again, George had to say his goodbyes. They said their goodbyes, he got on his horse, he went back to the fight down in Virginia. And that's where I'm going to stop, because when you hear the end of the story, you have to come and hear it at the Shriver's house. But I do want to tell you what we do in the Shriver house every day of the year. It turns out that the Shriver's home was built in 1860. The war started shortly thereafter. When the battle finally came here to Gettysburg, Hetty Shriver, at that point, she was 27. Sadie and Molly were 7 and 5 years old. When Hetty looked out of her front window and she saw cannons being set up in the street out front by Confederate soldiers, she was absolutely petrified. She decided she should take her children someplace safer. She grabbed Sadie and Molly. She walked 3 miles through the middle of the fighting to get to Hetty's family's farm, again, the Jacob Weicker farm, which sits at the bottom of the hills called Big Round Top and Little Round Top. So they were jumping from the frying pan and into the fire. They stayed there for 7 days because when the fighting was over and they were in, it was just absolutely devastating where they were. But when the fighting was over, there were almost 1,000 wounded soldiers left at just that one farm alone. So Hetty did stay for a little bit to help out. By July 7th, she couldn't take it anymore. She really wanted to come back home because she didn't even know if her house was still standing. She gathered the girls. They walked back to town. They barely recognized the town that they had lived in all their lives. It was a disaster. When Hetty got back to her home, it was her next door neighbor, Mr. Pierce. He told her what happened inside her house while she was away. The house was sitting there empty. The whole entire town was filled with Confederate soldiers, so they found that a pretty nice place to take over. They went up into the attic. They knocked 2 holes through the brick walls up there to shoot through. During the restoration, we found those holes. They were still there. Underneath one of the holes, we found 6 Civil War bullets. 3 of them are still live ammunition. They still have the gunpowder on the inside. We also found Civil War medical supplies hidden under the attic floorboards as well. The house was devastated. And for years, we would tell people during our tours that the house when Hetty came home, the house was a mess. But a couple of years ago, I decided, to say that is one thing, but to see it is something completely different. So that room that we saw a few minutes ago, that's all set up for our Christmas dinner, when you go into that room the rest of the year, that room and the kitchen are completely devastated. We have broken furniture, half-eaten food, liquor bottles all over the place, a nice big pool of blood, an overflowing chamber pot because those Rebs didn't care where they were going. And the house is just an absolute disaster. And I think it's a great thing to give people an impact on what, to say it is one thing, like I say, but to see it is something different. I think women cry. It was because it just looks so sad. Well, that's the real book. That's the story that we tell the rest of the year. And I hope someday you'll come and hear both stories, both for Christmas and for the regular story. We do have a book about the Shrivers. It's called The Shriver Story, Eyewitnesses to the Battle of Gettysburg. And in that book, I pretty much cover everything that we know about the Shrivers, and plus information about the restoration and family histories and those kinds of things. So I can't thank you enough. And if anybody has any questions about Christmas at the time, I'm really happy to try and answer them if I can. Cody, do you have any questions?
Thanks so much, Nancie. If you have any questions, you can use the hand raise or the I guess the hand raise feature down at the bottom in reaction, or just put them in the chat box, and we will make sure that they make their way to Nancie. It was really great, and I love that you were able to show some of those pictures. So Virgil asked, was there any musical instrument or instruments in the Shriver's home?
Very good question. We have a melodeon in there in the parlor. And at Christmas time back then, somebody during an open house party type of thing, somebody would pull up to the melodeon and play some songs, and everybody in the room would join in. And the funny thing is, a lot of the songs that they were playing back then are some of the same songs that we play at Christmas time today. So it's amazing how many you would recognize. A few years ago, I thought, wow, what a great idea it would be to play melodeon music for Christmas and give people an idea of what it sounded like. So it took me a while hunting on the internet, but I finally found a man who had recorded melodeon music. I bought the DVD, he sent it. I played it for one tour. It was absolutely horrible. That music that you hear at a carnival, that kind of music, that's what it sounded like. And I don't think people were real happy with it. So I never. So if anybody wants an old CD about melodeon music at Christmas time, let me know, and it is yours, because it's pretty sad sounding music.
All right. Well, Cody, we'll go to Gregory's question first, and then Beth has raised her hand. But Gregory asked if you could just speak a little bit about the restoration of the home.
Well, as I mentioned, you saw that picture in the very beginning. The house was abandoned for 30 years, and it was totally a disaster. The very first time we looked at the house, I was like, oh my God, that house is so gorgeous. And if you remember the way it looked in the very beginning, it was pretty sad. And my husband kept looking at me and said, are we looking at the same house? Because that thing is a disaster. And when we started the restoration, it was a lot of work. When we bought the house, there was no water, no electric, broken windows. We were told at one point in time there were 30 cats living in the house. But I have said for many, many years that everything about this house is sort of a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing is 30 cats living inside your house. That is not a good thing. But the good thing is almost every piece of flooring in the house was covered with linoleum, but they had never glued it down. It was simply tacked down at the edges. But being empty for 30 years, it was really a mess. But every single day was like Christmas. We found so many things. Of course, finding the bullets was the highlight. For me, the highlight was finding that little girl's shoe. I remember holding on to it that night when I learned about that thing about good luck. And just remember thinking to myself that, Hetty touched this shoe, Georgie probably touched this shoe, so did Sadie and Molly. That's really one of my favorite finds. But we have a display here of some of the artifacts that we found. And it was just every single day underneath fireplace hearths, inside walls, under floorboards. It was just incredible incredible how much stuff we found. And it was, like I say, every day was like Christmas.
Excellent. Beth, do you have a question to ask? I think you're unmuted by now.
Yeah. So when we talk about German customs in this case, are we talking about a particular part of Germany? Because Germany, mid 19th century were, there was, really different territories, very, very different, practices, I would suppose. And so I wondered, which part of Germany were we referencing?
Very good question, and I do not know. The Shrivers started arriving in America in the late 1780s or early 1780s. And I know that George's grandfather came from, trying to remember the name of the town, and of course I can't remember it right now. So we do know where they came from, but I'll be honest with you, I didn't research the details in that respect.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
So Dennis asks, what sources did you use to learn about these stories?
About the Shriver story at Christmas time?
Yes.
I have a lot of books on German Christmases. I went to Lancaster and learned about, because that's so German over there, and learned then. But lots of internet searches and book searches and talking. The beautiful sprinkly cookies that are on the table in front of Sadie and Molly's plates. A few years ago, those things are about 12 years old. No one is allowed to touch them. I take very, very good care of them. But it was an old German woman that made those. And she was telling me about some of her customs. And so it's just a variety of places where I found the information.
Excellent. RL asks, did the girls attend school?
Unfortunately, all the school records from that time period are gone. They were burned, I believe, many, many, many years ago. There were two schools here in town. There was a public school, and then there was a private girls' school. My guess is that they probably would have gone to the private girls' school because the Shrivers definitely had money. But I also have to be honest, I don't know at what age children started to go to school. So Sadie and Molly, in 1863, they were 5 and 7. I'm not sure what age they would have gone to start school. So I really wish that I did know, but I do not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would track right with traditional German value placed on education and Pennsylvania education. So that's interesting. I don't know if I knew that the records had been destroyed, but that's good.
With any luck, if I'm wrong and you can find them, I would love
in somebody's attic somewhere. All right, we've got two kind of similar questions here. These are the last two that I see right now, but this is probably the easier one. Where are the Shrivers buried? And I know the answer, but you can say it.
I can't tell you where everybody is buried. I don't want to give away our entire story, but Sadie and Molly Shriver are definitely buried here in town. Hetty Shriver is buried in Washington, D.C. Because eventually the family left and moved down that way. And there's an interesting story about Sadie. Sadie died when she was 20, unfortunately, of consumption, what we call tuberculosis. And she was buried here in Evergreen Cemetery. But when I went researching for her headstone, there was no headstone. It's written where she was buried, but there's no headstone. So about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, we did a fundraiser one summer, and I worked with Brian up at the Evergreen Cemetery. He was wonderful. And we raised money and had a headstone made for Sadie. And that year, it was so exciting. We met here at the Shriver House, trying to do it like Hetty would have done it. And we had Hetty and the other little girl, Molly, walk up to the cemetery. We had probably about 150 people follow us. And when we got there, we had a beautiful ceremony telling everything that we knew about Sadie Shriver. So today, when you go there, there is a headstone for her. And it was a silly thing, but I just love doing it. If you've ever seen that movie, Schindler's List, at the end of the movie, when they visit Schindler's real grave, everybody that walks by, they put a little stone on his headstone, which is, I understand, an old German or Jewish tradition. So I invited everybody, if they wanted to, right in front of the Shriver House here. I had a big bucket. And if anybody wanted to bring a stone to put on Sadie's grave, I didn't want to dump all those stones on the grave. So I brought the bucket up there and I stood there and I cried because I heard well over 100 stones being dropped into that bucket. And it just made my heart sink to think that for all those years, no one even knew that that little girl was buried there. And it's amazing. Every once in a while, I'll walk up to her grave and I see little stones on the grave. So it got through to people. I just think it's wonderful.
What church did the Shrivers attend?
They were Lutheran, like almost everybody else here in town. And they actually attended church in Emmitsburg. The farm where George grew up, and Hetty wasn't too far from that, is very, very close to the state line. And George's grandfather was one of the founding fathers of the church in Emmitsburg. I'm afraid I don't remember the name of it, but it's right in the middle of town. And the cemetery is still there. And George's grandparents are buried in that cemetery. So we think that he went there. George and Hetty also had a young son, a 3-month-old son, who passed away before they even built the house. And he is buried in a little cemetery out on way out on 20 Town Road. And I've seen his headstone as well. It's real sad. George had a brother and he had 6 children. Before the war, it was in 1858 at the cemetery down in Emmitsburg. He lost 5 out of the 6 children to influenza. And when you see that gravestone, there's a little tiny obelisk, and then there's just all these little teeny tiny stones next to it. I just can't imagine the heartbreak of the family going to the cemetery 6 times in 1 month, and they were all under the age of 13.
Wow.
Yeah, sad.
Well, we have run through the questions that are in the chat. The last message in there, Sharon says, great presentation. We visited both in the summer and at Christmas and loved both visits.
Oh, thank you.
Is it okay, Nancie, if I put the website in the chat? Is that the best place for people to find more information about visiting and hours and that? So if you want more information on the Shriver House and how you can visit, you can click on that link and get some more information. Do we have anybody else that has any questions before we say goodnight and Merry Christmas for the evening? Great presentation, Terry has said. All right. Well, once again, I thank you on behalf of the staff here at Seminary Ridge Museum for joining us for this very special, very interesting, I learned a lot, history happy hour. I hope that everybody has a very Merry Christmas, a very Happy New Year. I hope 2022 is good to each and every one of you, and that we hope to have you back here in Gettysburg soon, both to Seminary Ridge Museum, but also to the Shriver House, which is just down the road from us. So with that, we will see you again on January 21st at 6:30. We'll be sending out emails about that in the coming week, so keep your eyes out for that. And I hope to see you on the Ridge soon.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Cody.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Bob. It was lots of fun.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.